The wind slithered down from the hills like a forgotten hymn, whispering through Dawson's Hollow with the chill of old guilt. It rattled windows and stirred the dust that hovered thick in the air, shaken loose by wagon wheels, stomping boots, and the cruel crack of leather biting skin. Somewhere close to the center of town, a boy cried out. It wasn't a sound of protest or strength, but the brittle rasp of a voice worn down by hunger and exhaustion. He was small, no taller than the Reverend's pulpit. His limbs were sharp, angles beneath skinned to tight and to pale. A mop of greasy red hair clung to his temples, and freckles littered his face like sun bruises. A crumb clung stubbornly to the corner of his mouth, the rest crushed beneath Sheriff Mott's heel. He had stolen that biscuit, snatched it from a basket left outside the store, or maybe it had been planted there on purpose. In this town, it didn't take much to condemn someone who had nothing to begin with. Filthy little thief, sneered M. The shopkeeper, fists curling at his sides. Ain't his first time, neither. From the church steps, Reverend Amos Clay stood with hands folded tight, like he was praying judgment down with velvet-coated venom. Spare the rod and spoil the child, he intoned, his voice as sweet and sour as spoiled honey. Let his belly remember the lesson better than his ears. A man in a worn vest stepped forward with a leather strap in hand. The boy didn't run. Maybe he was too scared or too shocked. He didn't cry, not again. Not even when they bent him over the hitching post. His knees buckled once, then locked straight, whether out of pride or terror no one could say. Sheriff Mott stood nearby, arms folded, gaze fixed on the dirt. Once his eyes had been sharp, filled with purpose. Now they were dulled by years and too many regrets. He should have stepped in, maybe, but around here, justice had the shape of old iron bent in the heat, twisted sharp and unpredictable. The strap landed hard. The boy jerked, a broken sound slipping from his mouth. Again, then again, each strike rang louder, bouncing off the dry wood walls, echoing in the silence of a town that had long since traded compassion for survival. No one moved. No one stopped it. But the fourth blow never came. A voice, quiet and even, broke the stillness. He is my son. Time held its breath. Every eye turned to the edge of the square. There, half swallowed by dusk, stood a man, broad-shouldered, draped in a blanket patterned with lines older than the town itself. He looked carved from earth and storm. His skin was a dark, weathered bronze, his hair long and braided with streaks of gray like smoke. He carried no weapon, wore no badge, but his presence struck something in the crowd, something primal, something that made their spines straighten. Without knowing why, M started to speak, but the words dried up in his throat. The man moved forward, silent, steady. He stepped between the boy and the strap without flinching, never taking his eyes off the Reverend. Then he knelt and lifted the boy, cradling him like something sacred. The child sagged against him, conscious, confused, but no longer alone. He is my son, the man repeated, quiet but firm, and you will not touch him again. No trace of accent clung to his words, just the calm certainty of a river smoothing stones. The crowd waited, watching, waiting for someone to act, but no one moved. Sheriff Mott shifted, unease settling in his bones. Now hold on. I don't reckon I've seen you before, Elijah, the man said. Black Elk. A hush rippled through the onlookers. Someone near the back sucked in a breath. One of the cattlemen whispered, ain't he one of the Lakota out of Broken Pipe? Yeah, someone else muttered. Heard he brought down 6 bounty men up north. Walked right out of fire like it didn't even touch him. The Reverend lifted his hand, voice cutting and cold. You have no right to claim that boy. He's no kin to you. He's a thief, a stray. I saw it myself. Elijah's gaze didn't waver. His voice lowered, gentle but unwavering. He was starving. He was hurt, alone. And not a single man here helped him except to hurt him. That makes him mine. And by what right do you say that? The Reverend demanded. Elijah looked him in the eye. By the only one that counts, love. The word dropped like a stone in a silent pond. It didn't belong here. Not in Dawson's Hollow. It hung in the air, awkward and unfamiliar, like a prayer spoken in the wrong language. Someone snorted nervously. M stepped back with a muttered curse. Sheriff Mott rubbed the back of his neck. I don't rightly know what's lawful anymore, he said. "But I know enough to say this. You best go before someone does something they'll regret." Elijah gave one slow nod, not in surrender, but in recognition, without another word. He turned and carried the boy through the parting crowd. No one stopped him. No one dared. The Reverend shouted something behind them, sharp, righteous, but it fell like ash to the ground, unnoticed and unheard, from the shadows of the blacksmith's shop. Old Joe Pickens watched them leave. He spat into the dirt, then said to no one at all, "Well, looks like a real man just walked through this town." Elijah didn't travel far, only a half-mile east, past the dying cornfields, but far enough that Dawson's Hollow could no longer pretend it hadn't been seen. ***. Beyond the rusted wire fence, an old stable slumped under the weight of time. Its roof sagged to one side, and the gate hung broken, barely clinging to its hinges. Wild grass had taken over, and rabbits made their homes beneath the rotting floorboards. Elijah laid the boy down gently on a pile of hay, softening it with a worn blanket. He walked to the nearby creek, filled a tin cup, and carefully cleaned the blood from the child's back. The boy didn't cry, though his body trembled. His eyes flicked toward the doorway now and again, but they always returned to Elijah's quiet hands. When the wounds were dressed, Elijah placed some bread and dried meat near the boy, then sat silently nearby. The fire crackled between them, and above them, stars began to pepper the darkening sky. An hour passed before the boy broke the silence. "Why'd you help me?" Elijah didn't answer right away. He tilted his head as if listening to something far off. "I lost a boy once," he said eventually. "Long ago. He was about your age, tough, brave. Fever took him, and the world got quiet after." The boy stared into the fire. "They said I'm nothing," he muttered. "Said my mama was trash. And I'm worse. They lied," Elijah said calmly. A hush settled between them, heavy and honest. "You really gonna keep me?" the boy asked, his voice barely more than a splintered whisper. Elijah turned his full gaze on him. "If you want to be kept." The boy gave the smallest nod. "My name's Sammy." "I know," Elijah replied softly. "You shouted it when they struck you, like you were trying to vanish." The fire crackled. Sammy flinched, but didn't pull away. Outside, coyotes cried to the moon, long and low, like they were mourning something old. Inside the battered stable, warmth crept in slow, easing grief like the first thaw of spring. By sunrise, whispers would begin in town. Some would claim the boy had been stolen, others that Elijah was a cursed man. The preacher would rage from his pulpit, and man over bitter coffee would spit Elijah's name like venom. But none of it mattered in that moment. Not tonight, beneath a sky vast enough to hold all sorrow. A bruised boy had been noticed, and a man worn by silence had chosen to kneel beside him. The world wouldn't change, not outwardly, but something in the boy had shifted. A tiny spark buried deep, clinging beneath the frost. Dawn arrived shyly, like someone unsure they were welcome. Light trickled through the broken slats, casting long beams over the boy wrapped tight in his blanket. He hadn't moved all night, not when the fire sputtered, or when Elijah stirred the coals or stepped outside to scan the horizon. He was still, but breathing, fragile as a promise. Elijah knew how to listen for the quiet things, the creak of suspicion, the pull of fate, the way the wind changed when someone's eyes were watching. He heard it all. The boy shifted, his eyes opened in a rush, panic flashing as he sat up, braced for more pain. "You're safe," Elijah said, stitching an old leather strap with a bone needle. His voice was low, calm, and sure. "They won't come here, and if they do, they'll leave empty-handed." Sammy looked around, tools rusting with age, a broken saddle, the scent of smoke and hay still thick in the air. Then he looked at the man who had stopped the whip, who'd held him like something that mattered. "Why you talk like that?" he asked, groggy, "like you already know what I'm gonna say." "Because I've heard it all before," Elijah said, not pausing his work. Sammy watched him. "You don't talk much." "No point in wasting words," Elijah replied. "Words don't stoke the fire." Sammy went quiet, then suddenly spoke again, like releasing something too heavy to hold. "I don't got nobody, I know. My uncle used to lock me out when I didn't sell enough matches. I figured." The boy blinked. How Elijah didn't look up. Because you carry yourself like someone who learned too early not to cry. Sammy said nothing. He stared at his scraped hands, and the silence between them stretched not. Hollow, but full, like a quiet understanding had passed without being spoken. Later, Elijah took him to the river. At first, the boy resisted, dragging his feet, but the warmth of the sun loosened him. The river ran cold and clean, its voice older than any man's. Elijah handed him a chunk of lye soap. "You want me to get in there?" Sammy asked. "It'll sting a little," Elijah said, pulling off his boots, rolling his sleeves, "but it'll do you good." Sammy eyed the water, hesitant. Then he stepped in, bracing for the cold. It struck him like a slap, but he didn't make a sound. Elijah said nothing, just stood nearby, steady and close. When the boy came out, shivering and soaked, Elijah wrapped him in a towel and handed him a shirt too big, but clean. Sammy stared down at it like he wasn't sure it belonged to him. That afternoon, they walked into the woods behind the stable. Elijah taught him how to lay a snare, how to move without making noise, how to read the trees for signs of life. Sammy followed each instruction, eyes sharp with curiosity. When they checked the trap Elijah had laid earlier, there was a rabbit caught inside. "You really caught it," Sammy whispered, amazed. Elijah crouched beside the animal, handling it. "With care, if you listen close, the forest talks. If you move like you belong, it lets you pass." "You think I could catch one?" Sammy asked. Elijah glanced at him. "You already did." Asterisk asterisk. That night, the fire burned low, and rain tapped gently on the roof like quiet fingers. Sammy sat close beside Elijah, his knees drawn to his chest, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a small, broken button. "My mama had a coat," he said. Voice soft, "A real nice one. Blue, like cornflowers. This came from it." Elijah took it carefully, turning it over in his hand. The metal was worn down with time. "Keep it for luck," he asked. Sammy shrugged. "I think I hold onto it 'cause she touched it. Ain't got much else of hers." Elijah handed it back. "With care, then it's more than just luck. It's memory." Sammy stared for a long moment, then tucked it back into his pocket, pushing it deep. That same night, word began to travel through town. Old Joe Pickens saw them walking the trail, Elijah beside the boy, the child wrapped in a blanket like a cape. Joe didn't stop them, just tipped his head. But over cards and whiskey later, he told Harlan the innkeeper and one of the ranch hands what he saw. Said the boy's his son, Joe muttered. "And I'll be damned if I didn't believe it when I saw 'em together." Harlan scoffed. "You believe that? That kid ain't got a drop of his blood." Joe just shook his head. "Blood don't matter. Choice does." The next morning, Emp Gaines slammed his shop door as Elijah and Sammy passed. "Don't want trouble," he barked. "Not from beggars or redskins." Elijah said nothing. Sammy lowered his eyes, his fists clenching. Elijah gently placed a hand on his shoulder, reminding him that silence, sometimes, could carry more weight than 1,000 words. Not everyone stayed silent, though. On Sunday, Reverend Clay's voice thundered through the church. "Wolves in sheep's clothing." He preached, "Heathens taking what ain't theirs." A child being led astray by a hand dipped in war paint. Sheriff Mott sat in the back pew, arms folded, jaw tight. He hadn't spoken a word to Elijah since that day in the square. The Reverend's words left a bitter taste in his mouth. There was no law that said Elijah could take the boy in, but no law that said he couldn't either. Later, that week, Sammy grew quiet again. He sat by the stable door, arms wrapped around his legs, staring at the grass swaying in the wind. "They want me gone," he whispered. "I can feel it. They don't like you. They hate me." Elijah sat beside him, folding his tall frame down, slow like a tree bending with the breeze. "They fear what they don't understand," he said. "Fear's loud, but it's small." Sammy looked at him with wide, glassy eyes. "I'm not small." "No," Elijah said. "You're not." That evening, Elijah carved a figure from a piece of driftwood. His hands worked steadily, shaping it while Sammy watched in quiet awe. When it was finished, Elijah placed it in his lap. It was a horse, rough but proud, its legs uneven, its mane carved with care. "For you," Elijah said, "to keep in your pocket, so you never forget who you are." no matter what anyone else says. Sammy clutched it like it was gold, then tucked it into his coat next to the button. In the days that followed, they worked side by side. Sammy helped with trapping, learned how to pick berries, clean fish. Sometimes he hummed while they walked. Once, Elijah even caught him smiling as the wind spun leaves into little whirlwinds around their boots. But healing doesn't change the world. One afternoon, they walked into town to get medicine. The boy's cough had returned with the colder air. It clung to his lungs, stubborn and heavy. But it wasn't the sickness they feared, it was the looks. People didn't glance away anymore. They stared, not curious, judging. Still with him, they'd mutter, "He should be in a proper home." Harland watched them pass from the inn but said nothing. Just wiped his hands on a towel and turned back inside. Even old Joe, who once nodded in passing, kept his gaze down. The town had turned hard, folding in on itself like a fist. Mercy, it seemed, had become something dangerous. At the apothecary, a young man had taken over. His hands trembled as he handed over the bottle. 3 cents, he said. Elijah placed the coins calmly. Sammy stood straighter beside him. As they turned to leave, Gain stepped into their path like a locked gate. "You think you can keep parading him around?" he growled. "Think we're just gonna pretend that's right?" Sammy stood still. His fists tightened. His eyes burned. Elijah didn't answer. He never needed to. His silence had always carried more weight than most men's shouting. From the alley, Sheriff Mott emerged, watching, silent, like a man looking at diversions of himself locked in an argument he couldn't escape. Finally, he nodded toward Empt. "Let them through," Empt snorted, stepping aside. "Won't always be you there to stop it, Sheriff." Mott said nothing. Elijah passed by with Sammy, neither breaking stride. Sammy glanced up at the sheriff, meeting his eyes not with thanks, but something deeper, a challenge, maybe even a question. That evening, back at the stable, Elijah sat by the fire, rubbing ash into the lines of a new carving. Sammy watched him, eyes heavy with sleep. "You think it'll ever change?" he asked. "Maybe not the world," Elijah said quietly, "but maybe us outside." The wind brushed against the boards like a secret. Sammy closed his eyes, and for once, he didn't dream of pain. Morning came sharp, the wind scraping over rooftops like a rasp. Autumn had begun curling the valley in on itself, folding leaves inward like forgotten notes. Elijah and Sammy walked steady, bundles of firewood strapped across their backs. Sammy's cheeks were red from cold. His boots, still too big, thudded in rhythm on the dirt path, but he didn't complain. They were headed into town again for more medicine. The cough was worse now, but it wasn't the sickness that pressed on them. It was the eyes. The people no longer turned away. They stared accusing, unblinking, as though healing itself was the sin. Still with him, should be with his kind. Inside the apothecary, the young clerk fumbled the bottle again. 3 cents, he mumbled. Elijah paid without a word. Outside, Gain was waiting, arms crossed, blocking their way. "You don't belong here," he said. "You and that little stray." Sammy held his ground, eyes blazing. Elijah said nothing. Mott appeared again, stepping from the shadows like he'd been waiting for this moment. "Let them pass," he said. Empt sneered. "You won't always be there." Mott didn't argue. They walked past, and this time Sammy met the sheriff's gaze again, not with fear, with defiance, with fire. ***. As Sammy chewed slowly on a piece of jerky, the small wooden horse rested beside him. Its legs were scuffed from being carried everywhere. He never let it stray far. Sometimes he rubbed it like a charm. Other times he just stared at it, as if it held a memory of himself he hadn't fully uncovered yet. "Why do they hate you?" Sammy asked after a while. Elijah didn't look up from the fire. "They don't," he said quietly. "Not really. They hate what I remind them of." "What's that?" "That they're not who they pretend to be." Sammy nodded thoughtfully, chewing in silence like someone much older than his years. Later that week, the church bell rang at dusk, calling people in like moths drawn to light. Inside the town hall, lamplight flickered on anxious, tight faces. At the pulpit, the reverend's voice was sharp, his robe crisp. "We do not tolerate falsehoods," he declared. We do not allow children to be raised in the shadows, outside the law and the word. This drifter has laid claim to something not his. He's filling that boy's head with silence, with strange ways, with no God to answer to. I say we put a stop to it. The crowd stirred. Some murmured in agreement. Others looked unsure. Sheriff Mott stayed seated in the back row, hat resting in his lap. He didn't speak, but his jaw tightened with each word. After the gathering, the Reverend caught up with him beneath the old tree that creaked in the wind. "You have a responsibility, Curtis," he said. "This isn't about sympathy anymore, it's about what's lawful. That boy needs a roof, a name in a book, proper education." Sheriff Mott stared at the noose swaying above them. "You ever known a boy that quiet?" he asked. "That's not what this is about," the Reverend insisted. "It's exactly what this is about," Mott replied. "You're letting feelings blind you. What if that child grows wild, becomes like him? Then he'll be the finest man in this town," Mott said, turning away. Trouble came the next day. 3 local men, no badges, just stirred by sermon and self-righteousness, rode toward the stable. Elijah saw them from a distance, dust trailing behind. He stepped outside. Sammy stood behind him, heart pounding so hard it hurt. The first man dismounted. "We're here for the boy," he said. "He's staying," Elijah answered. "He's not yours." "He is now." The men stepped closer, not yet reaching for their guns but close. The air smelled of fire and something waiting to bleed. Sammy moved forward. "He's my father," he said, voice cracking, but eyes steady. "And I'm not going anywhere." One of the men chuckled darkly. "That's not how this works, boy." "It is now," Sammy replied. The man reached forward, maybe to grab, maybe to intimidate, but he stopped when he heard the click. Sheriff Mott stood at the edge of the field, shotgun cradled in one arm, eyes sharp and cold. "Go home," he said. "You're going to protect that heathen." "I'm protecting what's right." After a moment, the men turned and rode off. The sheriff didn't look away until they vanished. Then he turned to Elijah. "You're going to need documents, something to prove the boy's yours." Elijah nodded. "I'll help," Mott said. "But it won't be simple." "Nothing worth holding onto ever is," Elijah replied. That evening, Sammy sat close to the fire. His shoulders were straighter now, his eyes clearer. "When they came," he said, "I thought I'd be scared." "You were," Elijah replied. "But you stood anyway." The boy didn't smile. He simply nodded. "Feels different now. Like I'm not running anymore." "You're not." "Feels like I'm starting something." "You are." Sammy leaned back, hands behind his head, the carved horse gripped in one fist. "You think we'll ever leave this place?" he asked. Elijah glanced at the rafters, at the stars beyond. "Someday." "Where to?" "To a place wide enough that people ask more questions than they throw stones." The boy chuckled. "That even a real place?" Elijah didn't answer, but his silence was softer, warmer, more reassuring than most men's promises. Outside, the wind swept through tall grass, whispering the names of the lost who were nearly found. Back in town, Reverend Clay sat rigid at his desk, scribbling angry letters to officials. His hands shook not from doubt, but rage. He wasn't shaken because he thought he was wrong, but because something sacred had taken place beyond his control, and that he could not abide. But Elijah didn't worry about him. He'd known men like Clay before, loud, proud, brittle as dry gourds. His only concern was the boy, keeping him safe, warm, fed, and strong enough that one day he wouldn't need protection anymore. So the days passed, quiet and watchful. The town turned colder, but the fire inside the old stable never dimmed. The first frost came like breath held still, coating the grass in glittering blades and freezing the river's edge. Winter had arrived. Inside, the fire burned low, but its warmth lingered. Sammy lay beneath a blanket, coughing less, his face no longer so hollow. Elijah sat nearby, upright and half awake. He hadn't slept soundly in days. Sheriff Mott had managed to draft some guardianship documents, not legal in the truest sense, but enough for now, and in that fragile peace, they endured. ****. The paper stayed tucked inside Elijah's coat, neatly folded, though he never spoke of it. Sammy had once asked, "So it's real now?" Elijah had only said, It always was. But peace in a place like Dawson's Hollow was never meant to last. It was borrowed time. At midday, 3 riders set out from town. This time, there was no hesitation, no second-guessing, just grim resolve. At the front rode Reverend Clay, no longer hiding behind his robes or scripture. He wore a plain gray coat now, gloves tight on his hands. Beside him rode Empt Gaines and a younger man, Burke, broad and cold-eyed. None of them spoke as they followed the trail. The Reverend carried a warrant signed by a distant judge, a document born of twisted truths and burning anger. Sheriff Mott watched them pass from the boardwalk, saying nothing. His silence bled like an old wound left untended. By the time the riders reached the ridge, the sky had grown heavy with clouds, a storm poised but not yet falling. Below, the stable looked small, a thin line of smoke curling from the chimney like breath held to long. Inside, Sammy was humming while he cleaned the traps. Elijah was oiling a blade, not out of urgency, but out of habit. When he lifted his head, something subtle shifted in his eyes, a flicker, like a shadow brushing past his thoughts. "They're coming," he said. Sammy froze. "How many?" "3. One's the Reverend." Sammy's gaze swept the space: the wooden horse, the old coat, the worn button. This place had become home. "What do we do?" Elijah stood. "We face them." Not long after, the riders entered the clearing. They dismounted. Without a word, hands close to their weapons, the Reverend stepped forward, producing the paper from his coat. "Your time's up," he called. Elijah stepped into the open, his presence quiet but commanding. Sammy stood just behind, smaller but steady. "Now you bring the law," Elijah asked. "I bring order," said the Reverend. "You're unfit to raise that child. You've filled his head with myths and made him an outcast." "I gave him food," Elijah replied. "A roof, a name, my care. You gave him poison." The Reverend snapped, "Taught him to hate what's right." Sammy stepped forward, his voice firm. "I hated you before he ever came. You beat me. Called me nothing. Said my mama was garbage. But he never did. He just called me his." Burke shifted uneasily. EMTT scowled. "We didn't ride all this way to hear speeches. You came for a child," Elijah said. "You'll have to take him from me. You're outnumbered," Empt warned. "Count again." None of them had seen Sheriff Mott appear. He now stood at the edge of the clearing, rifle resting easy in his arms, boots caked with dust, hat low. The sun caught the shine of his badge. "No. One's taking that boy," the sheriff said. "Not with lies. Not with some paper signed by someone who's never laid eyes on him." The Reverend stiffened. "You defy the law, Sheriff." "I defy men who twist it," Mott answered. "This is my town." "He stays. Then you'll lose your place here," Clay said, his voice thick with anger. "I lost it the day I let a boy be whipped in front of his neighbors," Mott replied. "This is how I start to make that right." Burke lifted his rifle, uncertain. The world seemed to stop for a heartbeat. Then Elijah stepped forward. No rush, no threat. Just solid, unwavering presence. "You raise a gun toward a child," he said, voice low and even. "You better be ready to bury part of your soul." Burke faltered. His hands trembled. The rifle lowered. Mott raised his own, steady. "Put it down, son." Burke obeyed. EMTT didn't move. The Reverend stood alone now, shaking not with fear, but with rage. "This isn't over," he said. "You think you've saved that boy? He's cursed." Elijah moved closer, eyes locked on Clay. "Then I'll walk through the fire with him." Without another word, the Reverend mounted his horse. The others followed. They rode away, somehow smaller against the rising wind. Sheriff Mott lingered. "More'll come, eventually, I know," Elijah said. "I'll speak for you." Mott offered. "I've seen enough." Elijah gave a nod. The sheriff rested a hand on Sammy's shoulder. "You stood your ground," he said. Sammy managed a quiet smile. It felt right. "Keep feeling that." Mott tipped his hat and walked away. That night, the storm broke open. Rain fell hard, flooding the valley and soaking the earth. Inside the stable, Sammy carved a new figure by the fire, a bird this time, wings open wide. Elijah finished scrubbing the last soot from a pot and sat down beside him. "Do you miss where you're from?" Sammy asked. "Every day," Elijah said. Think I'll ever belong anywhere? You already do. Sammy lifted the small bird. Then I'll make more. The fire crackled outside. Thunder rolled across the plains. Years later, people would speak of that day as the moment Dawson's Hollow began to change. A boy stood behind a man, and the man stood between that boy and a world that tried to crush him. But in that moment, it was simpler than that. A man, a child of fire, and a storm held together not by walls, but by one unspoken decision to love and to protect Dot. And though the world would keep trying to break them, they would stand not because they were stronger than the world, but because they were complete. If you've ever been cast aside, left out in the cold without a name or a voice, then you know what it means to be saved not by miracles, but by someone who refuses to let you go. Be that person. And if the world raises its hand to strike, let it find no target. Let it meet resistance not in violence, but in unwavering compassion. Let it end there. If life has ever left you broken, forgotten, clothed in shame and silence, remember, kindness doesn't always speak softly or come in gentle words. Sometimes it walks barefoot through pain, carrying more than it shows, and offers only this: a place to rest and a reason to go on. Be that place. Be the strength someone needs.